Iran's Revolutionary Guard says that his nation is ready for full-fledged war. This is all happening after a weekend strike in Saudi Arabia that heavily damaged some of the world's biggest oil production sites. Yemen's Houthi rebels have not only claimed responsibility for this, they say more attacks could be on the way if the Saudis do not back off in Yemen. But some in the Trump White House, they're not buying that. Among them, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who tweeted that this is the fault of Iran and Iran alone. We should note that Secretary Pompeo did not provide any evidence for this claim, and Iran has thus far denied any involvement. But still, a top U.S. official tells CNN it is difficult to believe Iran or Iraq did not play a role, citing the strike's location as well as the sheer number of points of impact. That official says the Houthis could not have pulled that off with just 10 drones, as they claimed. CNN is tracking this fast-moving story from all parts of the world. Our senior international correspondent, Nick Payton-Walsh, is in Tehran. Our national security reporter, Kylie Atwood, is in Washington. But, Nick, I want to begin with you there in Iran. You know, we have been here before. President Trump ratchets up the military rhetoric, but you know, in the end, doesn't follow through with the military might. And he also did not specifically call out Iran like Secretary Pompeo did. So how is locked and loaded being received in the region? Is it real talk or is it a real threat?
Look, locked and loaded means bad things in this part of the world, but at the same time as that tweet was being put out, the Iran Foreign Ministry here were reminding people that often things Trump says last about 24 hours or so. So Iranian officials here, I think, possibly recognize the gravity of the accusations being thrown against them. They utterly reject them, but they also, too, I think, over the past week have learned with the departure of National Security Advisor John Bolton, Mike Pompeo's stark accusations that were delivered on Twitter but not backed up with evidence just yet, that they're dealing with the Trump administration that's often in turmoil about its policy towards this country. And its foreign minister, Iran's foreign minister, said, you know, maximum pressure is given away now to maximum deceit. I should say in the last few moments we've been hearing Iran's President Hassan Rouhani speaking in Ankara, saying that he believes the drones issue is less about oil and more about regional stability and security. I paraphrase here, and pointing towards the conflict in Yemen, where he says American and European armaments being used daily to put people under awful conditions. So there's clearly, I think, a feeling here that they're in the spotlight. They reject the accusations, but slowly we hear more from anonymous American officials about what they think really happened. But still, there's a massive lack of evidence for an accusation as stark as this. You say we've been here before, Brooke. We've not been really dealing with a crisis of this magnitude, damage at this scale, deep inside Saudi Arabia, really sort of the crown jewels of their economy, an embarrassment for them. Saudi's not come forward and actually blamed Iran directly. They said it's Iranian-made weapons. But we're potentially looking at developments, information being revealed in the days ahead that could massively worsen this crisis. And I think Iranian officials possibly are hoping that an off-ramp emerges and everyone can calm down a little, if I'm being honest. Brooke?
So on the point of Iran, right, which again, you're correct that Pompeo is providing no evidence. Kylie, you have new reporting on the U.S. intel community and its findings on the Saudi attack. What have you learned?
That's right. So we are learning that the U.S. has told at least one U.S. ally in the Middle East that the U.S. believes Iran was behind this attack, which, as Nick said, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has publicly said, but also that the U.S. has intelligence that leads them to the belief that Iran staged these attacks likely from Iranian grounds, that they didn't come from another place like Yemen. Now, we've heard U.S. officials say that Yemen, in their accounting and what they are seeing, is not the place where these were attacked from. But this would be new if these attacks, as these U.S. allies are being told in the region, did come from Iran. But we have not yet seen any of this intelligence publicly pronounced by U.S. officials. They are saying that Yemen wasn't to blame, but they haven't produced any proof that backs up their claim that Iran carried out the attack and that the potential that it was carried out from Iran staging grounds. And that is the real question here, when and if the U.S. is going to provide that intelligence and what kind of decision they're going to make about the Trump administration policy going forward. The diplomat that I spoke to about this and what the U.S. is sharing privately at this point with U.S. allies said it's one thing for them to tell us, it's another thing for them to show us.
Kylie and Nick, thank you both so much, both from Iran and in Washington. CIA intelligence and security analyst Bob Baer, a former CIA operative whose work at the agency focused on the Middle East, tells CNN that the attack on the Saudi oil fields could eventually force the U.S.'s hand when it comes to Iran.
It's very unlikely that Yemen has the technology to launch 10 drones, evade, radar, and the rest of it. And, you know, we're pretty well settled on the idea that the Houthis, who've claimed responsibility for this, are backed by Iran. We are inching toward a conflict with Iran. There's simply no way this administration or Europe can let this go because, you know, Abqaiq is a stabilization facility that provides up to 8 million barrels a day. And if you take that thing out and continue these attacks, we're talking about the energy supplies for most of the world.
Sabrina Siddiqui is a national politics reporter with the Wall Street Journal. She's also a CNN political analyst. So, Sabrina, thank you so much for being here. And I want to go back to President Trump's locked and loaded comment. All right. So in a tweet, in one breath, he says that the U.S. is ready to respond. In another, he says we are, quote, waiting to hear from the kingdom as to who they believe was behind this attack and how the U.S. should proceed. I should also point out the vice president's chief of staff says locked and loaded didn't necessarily mean military action, but it almost seems like the president is like waiting for permission to act. Do you think it's because of his close ties with the Saudis?
Well, it's highly unusual for any administration to outsource its foreign policy to another country, particularly one where we have as complex a relationship as we do with the Saudis. This administration, like previous administrations, has largely turned a blind eye to humanitarian atrocities in Yemen and supported the Saudi-led coalition there. There's been decreasing support for that effort from members of Congress. And then, of course, there's this administration's response to the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi that has raised a lot of questions about its closeness to the Saudi kingdom. The president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, is certainly very close to the Saudi prince, Mohammed bin Salman. And then there's just all the financial entanglements that the president's family have in the region. So the real question is the president's response going to be driven more by what is in the interests of the United States and its national security or by his personal rapport with another regime?
But can this be ignored? I mean, you hear Bob pointing out that this is, you know, such a massive supply of the world's oil.
That's going to be a very complex question for this administration because, on the one hand, this is a president who has repeatedly advocated in favor of scaling back U.S. involvement overseas, particularly in the Middle East. And at the same time, they're going to have to deliberate whether this can simply go unignored, what kind of response is appropriate. I do think that there is, however, a higher burden of proof as Americans are now wary of the lessons learned from the Iraq War. And when you take this president in particular and his penchant for inconsistencies and oftentimes outright not telling the truth, I think there are going to be a lot of questions facing his administration and what their motivations are in perhaps engaging militarily with Iran. There's been months and months of brinkmanship between Washington and Tehran. The president on multiple occasions has ignored the counsel of his own advisors in taking more provocative actions like labeling Iran's Revolutionary Guard a foreign terrorist organization, of course withdrawing from the Iran nuclear accord. He now has an opportunity to de-escalate if he sits down with President Rouhani.
Well, on that though, the president really lashed out at members of the media for saying that he would be willing to meet with Iran with no conditions, and he is claiming that that is incorrect. But let's just listen. This is the president along with his secretaries of state and treasury, what they have said in the last couple of days and in months. Roll it.
The president has made clear he's happy to take a meeting with no preconditions, but we are maintaining the maximum pressure campaign.
The president's made very clear he's prepared to meet with no preconditions.
No for preconditions? The next 3 years. Not as far as I'm concerned. No preconditions.
So you hear it for yourself. I mean, this is demonstrably false. So why is the president trying to pretend otherwise?
Well, it's unclear, and oftentimes he has this approach where he wants to appear tough at the outset of these negotiations, but he's trying to label these assertions that he was willing to meet with no preconditions as fake news. But the sources are his own cabinet officials. All of this notwithstanding, I think that's part of the problem with this president is there's so many inconsistencies at a time when you need steady leadership. And when it comes to this meeting, this is the first opportunity he's really going to have to sit down face to face with the Iranian president to actually de-escalate, because there's simply I don't think there's much appetite for another potential military conflict. And another thing that's happening is this comes at a time when the president, of course, has lost his national security advisor. He's surrounded by a lot of acting officials. It's not really clear who's calling the shots. Certainly Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has perhaps the most influence and is the one who holds the president's ear. It would be, I think, a lot more reassuring for people if this administration were coming into this from a position of strength. But it's been characterized, as usual, by a great deal of dysfunction, and they're certainly going to have to make sure they have a unified posture when they go into the UNGA, especially if they're going to sit down with President Rouhani.
I think you nailed it earlier, saying when it comes to foreign policy, is the president looking out for the United States, or is the president looking out for the president? Sabrina Siddiqui, good to see you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
New details today on the investigation into Justice Brett Kavanaugh's alleged misconduct before his confirmation, what we've learned about who was and who was not interviewed by the FBI. Plus, Senator Elizabeth Warren has yet to take on the... We are back. You're watching CNN. I'm Brooke Baldwin. New outrage today over one of the most contentious issues of the Trump administration, the sex assault allegations against Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh. At least 6 Democratic presidential candidates are calling for Kavanaugh's impeachment after the New York Times published an excerpt of a new book on Kavanaugh. Frontrunner Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, and Amy Klobuchar are all calling for further investigation. The book excerpt details a new allegation of misconduct when Kavanaugh was a student at Yale, and CNN has learned that in October of 2018, in the midst of Kavanaugh's confirmation investigation, that Democratic Senator Chris Coons actually urged the FBI in a letter to interview this one particular witness, the same person that the Times reports actually saw the alleged incident. Justice Kavanaugh has repeatedly denied the accusation, and the New York Times on Sunday put out an editor's note saying that the female victim in their original story declined to talk and that her friends say she does not recall the incident. CNN is not reporting any details of the claim because we have not independently corroborated it. But that's not all from this book excerpt. It also describes how an attorney for one of Kavanaugh's accusers, Deborah Ramirez, gave the FBI a list of 25 corroborating witnesses, but the FBI did not interview a single one of them. President Trump has sent multiple tweets defending Justice Kavanaugh, including this one that calls for Kavanaugh to start suing for libel and goes on to say, quote, or the Justice Department should come to his rescue. CNN legal analyst Ann Milgram once served as the New Jersey Attorney General. She's now a professor at NYU Law School. So, Ann, thank you so much for being here. And again, when you see the president saying the Justice Department should not come to his rescue, does the president not realize that the DOJ is not his personal law firm?
It feels like the president keeps forgetting that. And I've been a state, local, and a federal prosecutor. None of those offices, including the United States Department of Justice, work for the political head of the country, right? And so there's a deep problem with the president even using language that suggests that the Department of Justice should in any way be involved with rescuing someone. What is really the issue here is what the Department of Justice should have done. The FBI is a part of the Department of Justice. What has not been explained is why those 25 witnesses were not interviewed, why a full and fair investigation was not done. And what's deeply problematic is that the Senate majority, the Judiciary Committee majority, the Republicans did come to credibility. They made credibility determinations about Deborah Ramirez, and it's clear now that they did that without a full investigation.
Why wouldn't they have? I know they were tasked, they only had a little period of time, the FBI, to do this investigation. Why wouldn't they have spoken with the other 25 people?
So that's a great question, and it feels to me that that question alone is worth investigating, that Congress should be looking at this question, because it appears that they were very limited in scope by the Senate committee, that they were asked by the Senate Judiciary majority, again, the sort of Republican leadership, only to interview a very small number of people and not to do the corroboration or not to interview other witnesses that might have had information that related to the allegations. That's very unusual. I've overseen background checks as AG.
Yeah.
I've overseen probably thousands of criminal investigations, you always follow the facts and the evidence where it goes.
So that's unusual. What about the fact that Chris Coons, this Democratic senator, actually urged the FBI to reach out to this witness with key information about this alleged incident, back at Yale, and apparently the Times is reporting that the FBI didn't investigate. How does a letter from a sitting senator just get overlooked?
Right. I mean, that goes into the same bucket with if witnesses that they interview are saying, here are 5 people who also could provide information. If a sitting United States senator is saying someone came forward to me and has information that's relevant, we all would expect that the FBI would run down those leads. Whether or not there turns out to be credible evidence is a completely different question. But to not even start and have that conversation, I find deeply problematic, and I would not have run a background check or an investigation that way.
Okay. Let me move on to the opioid crisis. OxyContin maker Purdue Pharma is filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy as part of this framework for settling opioid litigation with more than 2,000 multiple state, local, and tribal governments. It's always been part of this settlement, the bankruptcy. So what happens next?
So this is part of a settlement with a number of states. I think 24 states and sort of counties and territories in the U.S. are part of this agreement. What's important to note is that there are a number of states that aren't. So this doesn't end the conversation about what happens to Purdue. In many ways, it starts the conversation. And the goal of the company is obviously to sort of halt. There's more than 2,500 cases that have been brought against Purdue, to halt all that civil litigation in an effort to find a settlement and restructure the company. But it really is the beginning, and there are lots of questions like how much money will come out of this, how much money will come out of Purdue Pharma, will other states ultimately settle, will the Sacklers who own the company be personally litigated against, and so it really is, it looks like it's a very big deal, and of course it is, but it really is just step one, and what I think will be a very long process to figure it out.
Okay, and Milgram, a pleasure. Thank you very much. The Republicans challenging the president are furious as some states cancel primaries, both arguments next. And Senator Elizabeth Warren rarely uses the teleprompter, but she will be doing so tonight. And one of her new plans would have targeted the president's sister. We'll look in New York's Washington Square Park tonight, where she will roll out this large-scale proposal for one of the defining themes of her campaign, tackling corruption in Washington. Warren will use a teleprompter. It's actually a rarity for the Massachusetts senator. And in no uncertain terms, she is using the president and his family as case studies for corruption. Among her proposals, close the loophole that allows federal judges to escape investigations by misconduct by stepping down from his or her post. Warren then cites the retirement of President Trump's own sister, a federal judge, back in April. Quote, Marianne Trump Barry resigned from the bench, ending an investigation into the Trump family's decades-long tax schemes, including potential fraud. She goes on, under my plan, investigations will remain open until their findings are made public and any penalties for misconduct are issued. With me now, CNN chief political correspondent Dana Bash. And Dana, we know, fighting corruption's been this undercurrent of really all of her plans. But what do you make of her using such specific examples? How effective will this be?
Well, look, she is trying to prove a lot of things, but one of the things she's trying to prove is that she's the best Democrat to go up against Donald Trump. So by citing not just any family member. In fact, I'm just reading through this plan again, which is very lengthy, as you can imagine. She cites several Trump family members. But on the specific issue of the president's sister, she's not somebody who has been really part of the political discussion as aggressively as you might think she had been, because there's just so much. The volume of questions and chaos coming in and out of the administration and swirling around the administration is so great. But what she's referring to is the fact that the president's sister retired at age 82, so it's not like, that would be that surprising. But the fact is that she retired apparently after she got word that there was an ethics investigation opening up after the New York Times did a pretty lengthy piece suggesting that she was involved in an alleged tax scheme back in the 1990s. So that's what that's referring to. And going back to the point I was starting to make about her proving that she's the best person to go up against Donald Trump, you can bet that there's going to be a tweet plus from the president because of her singling out his sister. But it's also important to note that this is that's just one thing. I mean, there's so many issues in here in this this plan that she put out and the speech that she's going to give about it, talking about the corruption that she alleges goes on, on many, many levels with Washington, but in particular, this administration, this president.
So we'll watch for her tonight, and then the Trump tweet plus. Let me ask you about this, too, just on a totally different subject. There are 3 Republicans challenging this president in the primary, but they are now sounding off after Republican leaders in several states actually canceled their 2020 primaries. And one of those challengers, former Congressman Mark Sanford, isn't actually ruling out a legal challenge in his state of South Carolina. And here's another. This is Joe Walsh. Listen to this.
We can't just cancel elections in this country. That's what Donald Trump is doing. He's literally canceling elections, and it's very easy to be pissed off at Trump, but we're used to this with Trump. He is a would-be dictator. He'd like this to be Russia. I've got to tell you, I'm blown away in my disappointment with the Republican Party, who is in cahoots with this president.
Did they have a point? And we should also note that both parties have done this in years past.
That's exactly right. That's what I was going to say. Yes, he does have a point, but it isn't unprecedented. If you go back to 1992, when George H.W. Bush had a real primary challenger, Pat Buchanan, the Republican Party also canceled some primaries to try to help the president. And it's happened in both Democratic and Republican administrations when their incumbent is part of their party. Okay. Having said that, this is a president who ran on a rigged system and fixing a rigged system. And so it's a bad look to cancel primaries if you say that you want an open and fair system in general, and that includes the party in which you are leading. It is also true, Brooke, that going back to that 1992 example, Pat Buchanan, obviously did not win, but it is an example through history of a real challenger to an incumbent, causing that incumbent to become a one-term president. George H.W. Bush lost in 1992 to Bill Clinton. If you go back to Jimmy Carter, he had a challenger by the name of Ted Kennedy, and then Jimmy Carter ended up losing to the Republican Ronald Reagan. So there is a history, a pattern of when an incumbent gets an actual challenger, them not surviving in the general election. This is a president, though, who has almost unprecedented support among the Republican base. So it's hard to see any of these 3 challengers really getting ahead. But going back to my original point, still, if you're going to say you're fighting against a rigged system and you don't allow people at least to be on the ballot and voters to vote within your own party, it's hard to make that argument.
Dana B., thank you very much.
Thanks, Brooke.
In the biggest labor strike in a decade, negotiations are underway right now. ISIS that's creating health scares all across this country has now taken a new turn. The Associated Press just conducted this investigation where it tested all these vaping products and found that many of them not only did not contain any CBD oil, but that they were spiked with illegal synthetic marijuana. Just last week, authorities in Wisconsin arrested 2 brothers accused of operating a massive illegal vaping operation. Investigators are testing dozens and dozens of vaping cartridges and jars of THC oil found in the brothers' home. Those arrests come as federal health officials are still trying to track down the exact source of lung illnesses linked to vaping that have killed 6 people and sickened hundreds more. Holbrook Moore is a reporter with the Associated Press who is part of this investigative team that conducted all this testing. So Holbrook, thank you so much for being here. And first of all, why would someone even want to do this, to spike to do the spiking, just to be malicious?
The best that we can tell, they do it for economic reasons. Synthetic marijuana is man-made. It's much cheaper to make that in a basement or a lab than it is to grow hemp and extract the CBD from it.
Wow. So you guys did this whole investigation. What was your biggest takeaway?
Well, the investigation started when authorities in Mississippi raided some gas stations and vape shops and tested the CBD products in there, and they found fentanyl. So we began to wonder, how big of a problem is this? So we surveyed the 50 states, and we found that in at least 9 states, CBD products had been tested, and these are mostly vapes, but also edibles like gummies, and found to contain synthetic marijuana, commonly known as K-Tour spice. So based on what we learned from the survey of the states and what we learned online from online discussion boards like Reddit, in which people talked about buying synthetic products or what they suspected to be synthetic products, we sought products, went out and bought them. We tested 30 total, and 10 of them were found to contain synthetic marijuana.
Did the ones that contain the synthetic marijuana, were they just off the street, or I mean from a legit dispensary?
No, these were purchased from a convenience store in Florida, in the panhandle of Florida, a CBD supply store in Maryland, and a CBD wholesale store in Los Angeles.
Wow.
As well as a convenience store in South Carolina.
And the people behind Spike Vapes leave few clues as to who, makes them or what's inside. So how is someone to know if they're getting a good product?
They don't know. If you don't do your research, you're not going to know. One of the brands that we tested, we purchased 7 from 3 different states, and 4 of those were spiked with synthetic marijuana. So even if you were to use that same brand, you might not know from location to location or time of purchase if it's safe or not.
And I know that it's the FDA that's in charge of regulating CBD, but if some vapes have the illicit drugs, the synthetic marijuana in them, then it's the DEA. Why can't law enforcement get a handle on this?
The DEA tells us that, they're fighting this unprecedented battle against opioids. You have thousands of people dying, and they have to set their priorities, and that's what it is. It's, drugs like fentanyl, methamphetamine, those type things.
Yeah, Holbrook Moore, I appreciate you coming on and you guys doing this investigation. Thank you very much. It's frightening.
I appreciate you having me. Thank you.
Sure thing. More on our breaking news this afternoon. The U.S. has assessed the attack on Saudi oil facilities. They're assessing that it came from within Iran, and now we wait to hear from the White House. Plus, even before this confirmation, the president said the U.S. is locked and loaded, but then the White House tries to backtrack by asking you to believe that up is down and left is right. New analysis. The candidate has released a plan to reform the criminal justice system, and it's one of the issues we heard a lot about at the most recent debate.
We have a criminal justice system that is so racially biased. We have more African Americans under criminal supervision today than all the slaves in 1850.
My plan is about making sure that in America's criminal justice system, we de-incarcerate women and children, that we end solitary confinement, and that we work on keeping families intact.
When you finish your term in prison, you should be able not only vote, but have access to Pell Grants, have access to be able to get housing, have access to be able to move along the way. I've laid out a detailed plan along those lines.
I recently spoke to several amazing women who are already working to improve the lives of women who have been incarcerated. Tina Charles and Kia Clark from the WNBA's New York Liberty have teamed up with an organization called Ladies of Hope Ministries, and its founder, Topeka K. Sam, turned her own experience with incarceration into action. Watch this. Topeka, tell me a bit about your story of incarceration and what you've tried to do to help on the other side.
Right, for sure. So growing up in New York, born and raised in Long Island, 2-parent home, franchise business owners, had every opportunity in the world, decided to go to college in Baltimore and end up getting caught up. You get away from the sheltered life into a different life like most children do, and ended up dating guys who were selling drugs myself, which eventually landed me in prison on a federal drug conspiracy charge. But when I was there, being privileged, even incarcerated, having visits every week, access to phone calls, being able to call friends and family, and realizing that most of the women who were there did not. And when they came home, they wouldn't have resources to come home to, that the conditions of confinement were unhumane, that people were getting beaten, raped, that they didn't have access to proper hygiene products. They would have no housing when they came home. Children were being ripped away from their parents. You know, we say mothers are being kidnapped off the street for charges that typically are being criminalized for poverty and addiction. And so God placed it on my heart to start the organization, Ladies of Hope Ministries. And when I came home, I created an organization that helps to impact thousands of women across the country.
I want to come back on exactly what you're doing to help, but Tina, all right, so how, like, I know the WNBA has been really powerful on social issues, right? Black Lives Matter, racial injustice, gun violence. But why women and why mass incarceration? Why does this matter to you?
I think it's really important, not just to myself, but to my teammates from the New York Liberty. I think it's awesome that, you know, we have this platform and we're able to advocate for what we believe in. And I think it's great that we're able to reflect that in our Unity Day and what we've been doing for the last 3 years that started in 2016. And it's great to have someone as Kia Clark to back us and to remind us that, you know, when you take your jerseys off after those 2 hours in practice, after those 2 hours in a game, you know, you're an individual in society, and we are impacted as well as African American women.
You know, I actually joked with Topeka, you know, before we joined you today. She rattled off maybe 10 or 15 things that we could do. What are the action items? What are, you know, those things as individuals, as an organization, as a team, that could really help the situation rather than just listening?
To any of you guys, like what?
Yeah, I mean, going out in the schools and talking to the youth. I was really surprised by how many parents stood up during that event and talked about how they wanted their young daughters to hear these stories. They needed young women to understand, you know, what where their lives could end up if they don't. You know, others are saying who have been negatively impacted by situations like this.
Tell me, I mean, you talked about how it touched your heart and how you are walking the walk now. How are you working to help women who are coming out on the other side?
So the way our work we call is EPIC. That's our vision. We say ending poverty and incarceration of women and girls. And so because of that, you know, in order to end mass incarceration, you have to end poverty. And the way you do that, you have to make sure that people have their basic needs met. I think it's a human right to have sustainable housing, to have food in your stomach. So we created Hope House, a safe space for women and girls to live. We created the Angel Food Project, which is a partnership with Instacart through Whole Foods, Fairway, and other supermarkets in the city, where we give out fresh bags of donations to families impacted by incarceration every day. And then in order to empower women to use their voice, we created a program called Faces of Women in Prison, where it's a speakers bureau, where we feel that women should not just tell their stories and continue to relive their trauma without actually being paid. Because here's another part of it where that's public speaking, and that's a whole career that someone can get into that also will help to change legislation. We do legislative advocacy. We connect women with jobs. We have partners with Caviar, Square, Instacart, where we're hiring women, even Chanel, where we're hiring women who can go into these corporations and have jobs and not worry about what happened in their past, but utilize all of their skill sets to transition their life for something that they can be proud of. So, I mean, we are doing incredible work because we are moving from that lived experience.
Thank you, ladies. And if you'd like to learn more